and else's. So, I will be explaining this particular paper because this is very useful in the current scenario and for the current understanding of the research gap. So this particular paper has actually given whatever comes in your mind that how the researcher frames the research gap. So it talks about the methods, it talks about the research design, it talks about the research gaps. So what was the method used in this particular paper was, they took 4 leading journals into account, the method and the research design of this paper. 8 randomly selected issues from these 4 leading US and European journals. The names of the journals are listed here: Administrative Science Quarterly, Journal of Science Studies, Organizational Studies, and Organization. So basically, they reviewed 52 papers, and the time period which they took was 2003, that is 2003 to 2005. So it is for your understanding that after reviewing 52 papers, you are able to conceptualize that how people find research gaps. Wonderful piece of work, admirable, my all salutations to the author. So what is the basic purpose of formulating the research question? That is, first, define the topic, clarify the domain of the research, that what objects should be studied, individual level and the social interaction level, and finally decide the type of the research questions. So basically, the process of formulating the research question and identifying the research gap is, which was scanned by 52 journal papers and found that there are 2 ways of formulating the research questions. One, gap spotting, and the second is problematization. Understand this particular, as was highlighted in this paper, that when you formulate a research question, there are only 2 ways. As per this paper, there are other ways also, which we will also be moving forward with, because gap spotting, comes from anywhere, is welcome. The second method here, which we talk about, is a problematization. So this is a bird eye view diagram of how we are going to move forward. When you talk about the gap spotting, the first spotting is your confusion. The second is your neglect spotting. The third is your application spotting. When you talk about neglecting can be something which is overlooked, something which is under-researched, and something which does not have any empirical support. So if you see the first part of the diagram, this is all about finding the research gaps. The second way of finding the research gap is a problematization. That is, the theories which are already in place, if you want to find out and go on to some different welcome departures, you need to critically work, you need to confront, you need some new idea, you need some quasi-problematization, and you actually need a problematization. Let me tell you here very, very frankly, then when you talk about and compare the 2 ways of finding the research gap, either by problematization or by finding the gap spotting, 90% of the research gaps are spotted by gap spotting, because it is the most favored, it is less time consuming. And if you talk about the problematization, it is definitely very, very time consuming, and you need a lot of patience. So people adopt the first method to find out the research gap. That is the basic modes of gap spotting: confusion, neglecting, and application. So we'll be taking it one by one. Now, the gap spotting is the prevalent way of constructing the research questions. They identified 3 basic modes of gap spotting. That is the confusion. The second is your neglecting part, and the third is your application spotting. So, these are the different versions of, say, spotting. And, if you talk about the same example which we are taking forward, that is taking 8 review papers, 2003 to 2005, reviewing the 52 articles. So we could able to gap spot. So this is how you need to, do your gap analysis. Like, how much is the confusion? And of course, when you talk about a confusion, you talk about the competing explanations. That is, one is saying this happens and the other is saying this is not happening. The one says this is the factor, the other says this is not the factor. So these are the competing explanations. So, it was very, very clearly identified in these that there was some confusion spotting. That becomes your area of research. It becomes your research gap because you don't have a very clear view in relation to the topic which you have chosen. The second is your neglect spotting. That is something which is the area which is overlooked. Some areas are under-researched. Some areas, they don't have the empirical support. That is, you don't have the requisite data to support your research gap. Similarly, sometimes the application spotting is missing. Like you have the specific versions, the extending and complementing the existing literature is not there. So we'll be explaining these one by one. So let me first explain you what confusion spotting is all about. The main focus in this way of constructing the research question is to spot some kind of a confusion in the existing literature. That is, the previous research on the topic exists, but available evidence is contradictory in nature. As I told you, that Mr. A is saying yes and Mr. Y is saying no. And Mr. C is saying they don't have a relationship. So this is a very clear-cut identified research gap because we have contradictory views on a particular issue, which we call it as a confusion spotting. Let me give you explain you with an example. This example is a big example, so I have put 2 examples. So let me give you a small example here. There are competing explanations in the literature to construct the research questions. That is, study of how the social networks influence the professional values. So suppose this is the question. So in her review of literature, she finds out a strong evidence that yes, the social systems tend towards the consensus in the values amongst their members. At the same time, there are ample studies that report the discrepancies among individuals' values in organizations. So look at this particular question. It says that the study of how the social networks influence the professional values. So there are few set of researchers which says yes, it impacts. There are few set of researchers which says it doesn't impact. So when you have a state like this, that means there's a strong confusion and there's an ample way of doing a research in that regard. So there are certain factors which converge and there are certain factors which diverse. So there is a divergence and there is a convergence. So both the issues are opposite to each other. So, the professional values change. How does this influence the existing social networks? So we can talk about on this because we have the conflicting versions. So spotting something neglected in the existing literature is the most common mode of constructing the research questions, in our sample. So this is one thing which I would like to state here, that there are different ways of addressing the research gap, of which the first I have already talked about, that is the confusion spotting. So this is one area of research which is very, very important to address. And similarly, we have, because here the factors, some factors are converging and some factors are diverging. So makes your theory a very conflicting one. So let's research and find out what your take is all about. The second is your neglect spotting. So when you talk about neglect spotting, Spotting something neglected in the existing literature is the most common mode of constructing the research question, right? It tries to identify a topic or an area where no good research has been carried out. So when you are able to spot something which no one has done before, is okay, that's a bullseye. It becomes your research topic and it becomes the research gap as well. So there is a virgin territory, a white spot of the knowledge map. So that produces an imperative for the alert scholar to develop his own theories, to develop that particular gap area. And it is possible that the neglect spotting is about an overlooked area. Suppose, nobody has thought before, and probably it is under research. Probably there's no substantial evidence for that. There's no data for that. So becomes our area of research. So the most common version of the neglect spotting was to search for the aspects in existing literature that has been overlooked, under research, and lack of empirical support. So application spotting is another way of finding the research gap. Spotting a new application in existing literature is a third basic mode of constructing the research question and finding the research gap. So let me just give you an example here. So we talk about the human resource policy here. An example of this version can be found in the Watson's research in 2004. He studies that the human resource management and the critical social science analysis. He reviews the existing HRM literature and concludes that it lacks a more critical perspective, right? So this is a question which comes in our mind that, okay, we have a policy, but it is not that critical. It is not that comprehensive. It is not that practical. Let's work upon it. So it becomes your critical area of review. You can frame the questions, you can identify the research gap and move on. So too much of HRM literature is actually prescriptive and normative. And in order to address this inadequacy, Watson's research task is to introduce a critical theory perspective into a current human resource management literature. Makes sense? So, similarly, to find out the research gap and to frame the research questions, we can have the combinations. Like, the gap spotting can be a combination of the two. Suppose the time period, probably the methodology, probably, some research question which no one has done before, the confusion spotting, the application spotting. So you can have various combinations, which is a welcome step, of course, because you are doing something additionally. You are adding to the existing knowledge, which is definitely a welcome step. So their aim is to explore the contradictory, double-edged nature of the knowledge by developing a theory-informed framework that highlights the assumptions about knowledge and its management. So it makes sense because you are using the combinations of the two. So sometimes, that gap spotting leads to some interesting theories. And however, if we look at how the researchers describe their ways of constructing the research questions in this 52 journal article analyzed in this study, none of them actually make a deliberate attempt to challenge the assumptions underlying the existing theory of the subject matter in question. I would like to take a pause here and reiterate what I want to make a point here, that people, they are just going back to my previous slides and show you here that what is the specific point I want to address here. Yes, this is the diagram. Look at the first part of it. The basic modes of gap spotting: confusion spotting, neglect spotting, application spotting, overlooked area, under research area, lack of empirical support. So this is the framework where they always swing and they don't want to challenge the existing theories. So this is actually, the actual scenario. I'm not debating whether it is a good part or a bad part, because, unless and until you have a deep knowledge about the previous theories, how those theories evolved, what are the new theories you're looking for. I cannot comment about it. Another thing I want to reiterate here is, suppose some previous theories exist and you have a deep knowledge of how these theories evolved and how these theories are functional and what research has been done before. You have a complete framework in your mind that this is how it looks upon. So basically here, here we are talking about a gap spotting, which is very evident because you want to just move into that particular swing, zig zag. You just don't want to just, refute or say question the assumptions of the previous theories. If you are able to do that, it becomes so interesting. Each one of your work, the publisher will pay you for the publications. You don't have to pay for the publications because you are on to some interesting theories. You have refuted the assumptions. You have questioned the assumptions. Of course, your work will be applauded to a substantial extent. So now this kind of a work is very inadequate. This kind of a work, people don't want to work. So this is a question mark here. People, they just want to just spot the gaps, move around the bush, moving on to this part. Okay, he has done in America, I'll do in India. He's done in Thailand, I'll do in America. He's done in America, I will do in South Africa. So, the places they would like to spot the different places. They maybe they want to add some more span of say time period. They want to add some regional integration flavor, and they just don't want to refute the assumptions of the previous theories. If you're able to do that, wow, it's a beautiful work, and this is what we actually strive for. So, but the confusion is all about that they just don't, they want to just span their theoretical camps in that particular area only. They just don't want to take a flight. They just don't want to refute the previous assumptions. Mind it, if you dare to do that, interesting. If you dare to do that, publishable. If you dare to do that, you'll be applauded. But yes, don't refute all of the assumptions. A big advice from my side. Otherwise, your work will be called as absurd work. Your work will be rejected because it's not easy to come on with a new theory. It's not easy to, find out what people have done before. And if you are daring to challenge their work, there's something beautiful you should, produce. But do it on a moderate scale. Do it on a scale which is appreciated, which is good. Your all endeavors will be liked. If you are refuting everything and saying no to the previous work, your work will be completely rejected, right? So keep this in mind. So basically, the second part now I'm coming on to is a problematization to find out the research gap. This is what I'm talking about. Yes. Making your own theories, refuting the previous ones, talking about the assumptions, become a critique, challenges the assumptions of the previous theory. This is the main ingredient of problematization. So it is very important for all of you to understand what the problematization is all about. So it is an endeavor to know how and to what extent it might be possible to think differently. Yes, you are now on a different continuum. You are now on a different bus. You are now on a different footing. X, Y. North Pole, South Pole. So if you want to bridge the gap, come out with a new theory, come out with the new assumptions, and probably if you talk about carrying forward with the old theory, refuting few assumptions, become a critique, introduce another assumption, or talk about the functioning of that particular theory in your own beautiful way. So you are actually appreciated because you're coming out with something new, something different. So this endeavor of yours will be adored in the research fraternity. So when you talk about the problematization, the central goal in such problematization is to try to disrupt the reproduction and continuation of an institutionalized line of reasoning. So that means for years long, you are talking about the same theory, you're talking about the same reasoning. Time for you to break and move on with a new theory. Dare to do that. I know it's difficult, but it is not impossible, because what a human mind can conceive, you can achieve. So it means taking something that is commonly seen as good and a natural and turning into something which is, problematic and problematic. So understand this issue, understand this world. So problematization, as we define here, aims to question the assumptions underlying the existing theory in some significant ways. And moreover, we do not see problematization as an end in itself, as is done in some research orientations. The postmodernism, feminism, critique theory, and we see it as a means to identify and challenge the assumptions underlying the existing theory. So become a novelist. Novelist in terms of introducing some novel questions, some novel theory, some novel assumptions. If you do that, that's a superb way of coming out with a research gap. Although if you talk about problematization and gap spotting, it varies in the range, it varies in the complexity, it varies with the assumptions. But yes, you should be able to underline the theoretical field and the way forward. So problematization does not need to involve challenging the assumptions underlying an entire paradigm and thus produce a revolution. It could be moderate assumptions also. So try and be moderate in your approach. Try become an intellectual. So it, however, says that if you become a minor critique and saying no to few assumptions is better than to reject an entire theory, because it's a bad thing, because people will start saying, okay, he's wrong, the old theory and old is gold, something like this. So if you want to actively challenge, go ahead slowly, refute the problems, come out with the assumptions, and have the research gaps. So these problematization turns are actually good, but yes, the preferred way, again I'm telling you, for the researchers is to find out very, very smoothly the gap spotting. So why it is more likable. So the answer to the question of why, there are so few examples of problematization and is not likely to lay inside the investigated research text, although they indicate the gap spotting is a favored approach or a possible rhetoric legitimizing research papers. That is, saying it with a road, okay, yes, this is the case. People have a strong liking for gap spotting. Why? Gap spotting is easy. It is uncontroversial. It is absolutely safe. And a powerful tradition indicates the knowledge accumulation. Academia is a crediting economy. You cite my paper, I'll cite your paper. So it's easy, increase your H&I index on a Google Scholar. Talk about Web of Science index, talk about Scopus index. So academia is all about crediting economy. So moving out in this transition of gap spotting is a easier recourse for all the scholars, with very few exceptions. Academia, as I said, is a crediting economy, and the research institutions encourage that gap spotting. Contemporary journals format encourage gap spotting, and it often makes sense to adopt the gap spotting also. So the alternative to the gap spotting is the problematization, which is extremely difficult in your approach. So this is what, we move about. So now we will be talking about some flagging routes to the research questions and finding out the research gap beyond gap spotting. Without denying the relevance and the advantages of the gap spotting, we believe it is important to loosen some of the set of the social norms that strongly encourage the researchers to use and internalize the gap spotting as the preferred way of constructing the research question from the existing theory and motivate to broaden our norms and methodological guidelines for knowledge production. So they are not only encouraging the gap spotting, but also enabling and actively promoting the development of the approaches that focus carefully and critically on the assumptions, worldviews, perspectives, conventions, selective language, and other elements in formulating the research questions. So I'm going to talk about some other routes now. Be a critique. Upfront, have a critical confrontation. So the researcher, if you criticize a theory or a field based on identification of some shortcomings, it will be beautiful. So that means you are able to find out and bullseye on the critical perspective, which becomes your question as well as the gap. Come out with a new idea. This simply means that the author emphasizes a new idea. The author claims that the innovation and it does not follow any route which is marked by the literature. You are on a new paradigm, you are on a new frontier, and you have invented. So come out, it's a welcome step. Come out with a new idea. This means that the sidestepping, both building and challenging the existing studies. It calls for original thinking, high level of confidence, deep knowledge. So increase your domain, your knowledge, and find out something which is super, which is new, which is contradictory, which is critical, which is problematic. So it is going to make you a good researcher, and you're going to make good, substantial footprints in the research fraternity. So the next research gap you can find out by quasi-problematization. What is a quasi-problematization? In case there is a problematization claim that, yes, I have invented this theory, but actually the researcher is just smuggling in a very prefabricated manner, in a ready-made alternative, which is already done, but you are presenting this as a genuine problematization. So this is what is called as a quasi-problematization. So this sounds harsh, and more positive framing may make sense. So it is also often difficult to distinguish between a quasi and a genuine problematization. A skilled critique can perhaps identify where the critical turns and upturns are taking place. So both gap spotting, problematization can vary in scope and complexity. It is you who has to decide that which way you need to find out the gaps and frame your questions. So there are, in most projects, some ingredients, some steps, some considerations, some factors, some combinations of major and minor. So this is how we, move on. So the summary of the basic models which we have discussed is about this, like you are into a track bound modes. So it could be a confusion spotting, it could be a neglect spotting, it could be application spotting. Combined track bound and disruptive modes, like, just saying no to the previous work. It could be critical, it could be a new idea, it could be a quasi problematization, and it could be a problematization. So, this is just, I'm concluding this and moving on to the hypothesis part because they are all interlinked, intertwined. Our primary aim in this study has been to investigate the ways in which the research constructs the questions from the existing literature and find out the different ways. And we actually came on to this, that the centrality of scrutinizing and challenging the assumption for producing interesting and influential research, we think it is necessary to question and wide use of gap spotting within the studies. Probably there are some critical confrontation, new ideas, quasi-problematization and problematization, but the most favored way is your say, moving on to the literature, just changing the aspects, and the gap spotting is the most favored one. If you can see here, I have just put the link of this paper, and again a request to all the scholars to read it at least thrice. It is going to open your mind. So, now moving on to the formulation of hypothesis. The word hypothesis consists of two words, hypo and thesis. Hypo means tentative, which is subject to verification, which is subject to change. So, and the thesis means a statement about solution of a problem. So thus, the literal meaning of the term hypothesis is a tentative statement about the solution of the problem. So the hypothesis offers a solution of the problem that is to be verified empirically and based on some rationale. So, understand this particular statement. The hypothesis is giving you a solution, of a problem, which you can verify empirically on the basis of some rationale and build your theories. So hypothesis is a tool to build a theory also, because whatever you think, whatever you have in mind, which is tentative, you have some rationale, some basis for framing that question. And if you're able to verify that, of course, you are not far behind then framing of your own theories on the basis of hypothesis you have framed, on the basis of verification of the hypothesis you've done. So you have a substantial reasons, you have a substantial evidence that whatever policies you're making makes sense. So hypo means the composition of two or more variables which are to be verified, and the thesis means the position of these variables in the specific frame of the reference. So, formulation of hypothesis. Hypothesis means less than or less certain than a thesis. It's a presumption. So, it is a presumptive statement of a proposition or a tentative guess based upon available evidences. So, because of my little knowledge of what I have this in mind that yes, digitalization of education is going to improve the teaching learning process. Suppose, because I have some rationale in mind, because it is anywhere, anytime, 24 hours, you can play the videos, you can rewind them, you are onto a MOOCs platform that is massive open online courses. So this is going to substantially increase the knowledge of the students. So with this little knowledge, I have this framed a hypothesis. So if it works, if I verify that, of course, I can frame a theory of digital education for that matter. And going to make a mark in the research fraternity that yes, she has made something new, something good, which is evidence-based, which has substantially been proved. So hypothesis is considered as a a very powerful tool in the research process to achieve a dependable knowledge, because you have variables, you have connections, you have relationships, and you have a verification of whatever you have in mind. So hypothesis helps a researcher to relate the theory to the observation, and again the observation to the theory. So this is a beautiful concept. So on the basis of the theory, of framing the hypothesis, you are moving on to a new relationship, you are verifying it, again you're making a theory. So it's like that. So it helps the researcher to relate the theory and to have a deep observation, verification of that theory, and observation to that theory which was taken in the basis. So hypothesis enables to locate and identify the variables involved and suggest the methodological procedures. So this is very important. Now coming on to the characteristics of what hypothesis is all about. It is conceptual. Some kind of conceptual elements in the framework are involved in hypothesis. It's a verbal statement in a very declarative form. It is a verbal expression of the ideas and the concepts. It is not merely a mental idea, but in the verbal form, the idea is ready enough for the empirical verification. Like I told you, that either the relationship exists or the relationship does not exist. So if we negate the relationship, it's a null hypothesis. If we say and prove a statement about the relationship of two, it's like acceptance of that statement or acceptance of that relationship. So whatever you frame, it is subject to empirical verification. So it exists, the tentative relationship between two or more variables, forward or future oriented. The hypothesis is always future oriented. It relates to the future verification, not the past facts or the information. So always keep this in mind, that it has a future and a forward orientation rather than a backward orientation, because we move forward in terms of the future, in terms of the future verification, in terms of the relationship with the future, in terms of the facts of the future, in terms of the information of the future, not going backward, right? So it's about the pivot of a scientific research. All research activities are designed for verification of the hypothesis. Now, when you talk about a hypothesis, it's a very temporary solution of a problem concerning with some truth which enables an investigator to start his research work. It offers the basis in establishing the specific what to study for and may provide the possible solutions to the problem. It may lead to formulate another hypothesis, and a preliminary hypothesis may take the shape of the final hypothesis because you have a basis, you have proved it, you have a validation, you have a verification, and so initially what you frame could take the final shape of the hypothesis. Each hypothesis provides the investigator with a definite statement. So you cannot have one hypothesis for many statements. Each statement will have one testable hypothesis. For a definite statement, one hypothesis separately is required. So each hypothesis provides the investigator with a definite statement which may be objectively tested and accepted or rejected, and leads for interpreting the results and drawing the conclusions that is related to the original purpose. So keep this in mind, that for each statement what you want to prove, you will have a separate hypothesis. Hypothesis, when verified, becomes accepted or it is rejected. If it is accepted, it's the basis for formulating a new theory, a new school of thought, and probably drawing the interpretations and the conclusions and the results. So actually it delimits the investigation of in the field of investigation. Suppose one particular statement is proved by hypothesis testing, move to the second, move to the third, move to the fourth. So it delimits basically the field of investigation, because you are verifying it, one by one. So delimit your field of investigation, formulate the hypothesis for each statement separately, for exception or rejection, for interpretation, and drawing conclusions related to the original purpose for which the hypothesis was framed. It sensitizes the researcher so that he could work selectively and have a very realistic approach to the problem. So that means the contribution of hypothesis testing is superb. It gives you a domain, a healthy domain, wherein you can actually relate theory with practice. You can actually make new theories. You make your work, verifiable. You make your work acceptable. You make your work selective. You make your work deep. You make your work realistic. So this is how it works, and this is what the functions of hypothesis are. There's a deep importance of the hypothesis, like investigator's eye. So the Carter versus good things that by guiding the investigator in the future investigation hypothesis serves as the investigator eyes in seeking the answers to the tentatively adopted generalizations. See, you have in the present contemporary world lot of generalizations, which you make like this, but generalizations are not accepted at large. Why? Because they are not subject to investigation. They are not verifiable. So if you want those generalizations to be effectively used by the society at large, so become an investigator. Hypothesis is the eyes of investigator because it verifies it. It converts your generalizations into the specific outcomes on the basis of which you can formulate anything for that matter. It actually focuses on the research because sometimes the research is unfocused, random, which is not the actual researcher's cup of tea. The researcher's cup of tea is what? A focused, a narrow, a deep research. For that, hypothesis is a very vital tool to achieve the focused research. And of course, clear and specific goals, as well thought out set of hypothesis places very clear and specific goals before the researcher work and provides him with a basis for selecting the sample and the research procedure to meet these goals. So it is the eyes of the researcher, it makes the research more focused, you're able to optimize on your specific and a very clear goals, and it links together, like it serves the important function of linking together related to facts and the information and organizing them into the wholes. It prevents the blind research. So in the words of P.V. Young, the use of hypothesis prevents a blind searches and indiscriminate gathering of the masses of the data, which may later prove irrelevant to the problem under study. So make specific statements, make specific objectives, make specific problem, make specific hypothesis, test it. It is going to make your work very focused. Otherwise, there are reasons and there are circumstances wherein your work will be irrelevant for that matter, and it may prove irrelevant in the later period. So start focusing from the very beginning on the realistic hypothesis with the substantial evidence, verifiability, embedding these features into your hypothesis. And it's, of course, it's a guiding light. It serves as a beacon for your research work. So now coming on to the different forms of hypothesis. We have different forms of hypothesis, which we will discuss one by one. The first is your question form. A hypothesis stated as a question represents the simplest form of empirical observation. It fails to fit most definition of hypothesis, and it frequently appears in the list. So there are cases of simple investigation which can be adequately implemented by raising a question rather than dividing the hypothesis into forms into acceptable or rejectable areas. So simple form of hypothesis, ask a question. The second is your declarative statement. The second form of hypothesis is your declarative statement. A hypothesis developed as a declarative statement provides an anticipated relationship or a difference between the variables. So such hypothesis developers has examined existing evidence which led him to believe that a difference may be anticipated as an additional evidence, and it is merely a declaration of the independent variables effect on the criteria variables. So that means you declare any kind of a statement. Then we have a directional, unidirectional, bidirectional. So a directional hypothesis denotes an expected direction that fall in price will lead to rise in demand. So there's a direction. So this type of hypothesis developer appears more certain of anticipated evidence. So it seeks a capable hypothesis is the general interest for the researcher. This is this type is very safe. It has only two possible conditions. Either it is there or it is not there. So first, the problem of seeking relationship between the variables is so obvious that additional evidence is scarcely needed. Secondly, the researcher has examined the variables very, very thoroughly, and the available evidence supports the statement of a particular anticipated outcome. So this is very important for you to understand the directional hypothesis, which is not actually liked. The next is your non-directional hypothesis. This hypothesis is stated in a null form, that is, you negate a relationship, which is an assertion that no relationship or no difference exists between or amongst the variables. Null hypothesis is a statistically hypothesis testable within the framework of probability theory. So it is a non-directional form of hypothesis, and there's a trend to employ or develop the null hypothesis in the research in most of the disciplines, be it science, humanities, commerce, etc. So null hypothesis negates the relationship, and it tentatively states that on the basis of the evidence tested, there is no difference. Statistically, tests of significance are used to accept or reject the null hypothesis. If it is rejected, the general hypothesis is accepted. So, the formulation of the testable hypothesis. A poorly chosen or a poorly worded hypothesis can prevent the following: the obtaining of enough pertinent data. That means a lot of care has to be taken as far as the framing of the testable hypothesis is concerned. Otherwise, the purpose of framing of the hypothesis is defeated. Use appropriate words, directional, question, the different types we have done. Associate with the different types. Keep the literature of hypothesis in front of you, that what kind of thoughts are coming, relate with the theory, then formulate your hypothesis. Because it is the hypothesis which is going to generate everything. Even the theories formulation are on the basis of hypothesis testing. So a poorly chosen or a poorly worded hypothesis can prevent good, pertinent, important data, which is very essential for the interpretation and collation of the results, without which you will not be able to articulate anything for that matter. And of course, the drawing of the conclusions and generalizations, the framing of the hypothesis is very, very important. And the application of certain statistical measures in the analysis of the results. So, these are the possible reasons for which the hypothesis framing is actually required. There are some difficulties in the formulation of useful hypothesis. Why? Because as was addressed by your principal in the beginning, that students, they are not well versed with the framing of the hypothesis. So my advice to all of you is read extensively before you do anything. Understand the different nuances of the theories, of the factors, of the circumstances, about the literature, about the global context, about the Indian context, everything about the topic. Have a deep knowledge of everything. Then start formulating, you'll be on the top. Because one of the prime reasons because of which you are not able to formulate the right hypothesis is because of lack of knowledge and clear theoretical backdrop. So that framework, if it is missing, how will you be able to make and frame the good testable hypothesis? So a good theoretical base is very, very important. The lack of ability to make use of theoretical framework logically. So understand the logic, understand the direction, understand the context. Talk to yourself, talk to your co-researchers, talk to your supervisor, because the more you talk, the more important, aspects are going to creep in. They are going to emerge. They are going to upsurge. So lack of ability of the theoretical framework logically is very, very problematic. Understand, have a deep knowledge of whatever you're doing, swim into the ocean of knowledge, catch the critical points, where you're going, understand what techniques are used earlier. So lack of acquaintance with the available research technique is also one of the problems. You're not able to frame the hypothesis. Upskill yourself. Start attending the faculty development programs more often. Start watching free research YouTube videos as far as possible. On one topic, see at least 10 videos. You'll have some clarity. Attend a faculty development program. Talk to your mentors. Talk to your supervisors, your fellow researchers, because they are also in the same journey of research. So they will be able to give you a fair idea of what and how the hypotheses are going to be framed. So coming on to the basic concepts concerning the testing of hypothesis. There's a null hypothesis and there's an alternative hypothesis. So in the context of the statistical analysis, we often talk about the null hypothesis and the alternative hypothesis. The null is represented by HO and the alternative can be HA or H1 also, depends. So if you are to compare the method A with method B about its superiority, and if we proceed on the assumption that both methods are equally good, then this assumption is treated as a null hypothesis. That is, you negate a relationship. So as against this, if we think that method A is superior or the method B is inferior, then it is an alternative hypothesis. That is, the null hypothesis is generally symbolized by H0 and alternative by HA. So, this is, you'll frequently talk about it. The second is your level of significance. So this is very important concept in the context of hypothesis testing, that it is always some percentage you will keep in mind. 1%, 5%, 10%, and usually the most favored taken is 5%, which should be chosen with a great care, with a thought and a reason. So in case we take a significant level at 5%, then this implies that the null hypothesis will be rejected when sampling results. It has a less than 0.05 probability of occurring if null hypothesis is true. In other words, 5% level of significance means that researcher is willing to take as much as 5% risk of rejecting the null hypothesis when H0 happens to be true. So that means there's not a big risk at all. Thus, the significance level is the maximum value of the probability of rejecting the null hypothesis when it is true and usually determined in advance before testing the hypothesis. So there are two types of errors which I would like to make a mention here, type 1 and type 2 errors. In the context of testing the hypothesis, in the context of testing the hypothesis, there are basically two types of errors. We may reject X0 when X0 is true, and we may accept X0 when fact X0 is not true. So the format is known as type 1 error, and the later is known as the type 2 error. So type 1 error means rejection of the hypothesis which should have been accepted, and type 2 error means accepting the hypothesis in which it should have been rejected. So type 1 error is denoted by alpha, and and also called the level of significance of the test, and the type 2 is denoted by beta, right? So these are the important steps. So these are the following steps which are actually used for hypothesis testing. State the hypothesis. Be sure to state both the null as well as the alternative hypothesis. Select a level of significance, 1%, 5%, or 10%, depending upon your theory base, depending upon your context, depending upon the factors. Calculate the test value. Calculate the probability value. Make a decision and summarize the results. So this is how we move on, and this is how we get to the hypothesis testing. I have another beautiful PPT with me, which is having deep construction steps of the hypothesis testing, which definitely I will share the three resources with you, two resources with you. One, this PPT, which I have collated from the internet. It is not my own. I have specifically made it for the facilitation of the researchers. I have kept all the links in the reference section from where I have collated for your reference and your necessary action, and will be sharing another PPT, which is very important for the hypothesis testing. So I take a leave and thank you so much. If you have any questions, I will answer them and give my answers to Professor Anil Mehta, because I'm the master of ceremony of a world debate which is going on, and the timings were 6 o'clock, and I'm already late by 30 minutes because I committed with Modi sir. So it was all my pleasure to be here. I have sent some other moderators. Being the master of the ceremony, I have to be present as soon as possible. So whatever questions you have, I will be very happy to answer and post with Modi sir or with Professor Anil Mehta. It was simply a pleasure addressing all of you. Love you all, and thank you so much for calling me on this dais. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Professor Namita ma'am. It was really a wonderful experience for all of us. It was really wonderful presentation by you, ma'am. And I think participants have learned a lot of things from today's session. We are so lucky to have you in this workshop, ma'am. And if there any question regarding anything, regarding any query, you can ask participants. You can raise your hands and I will unmute you.
So kindly, if you can post me, because I'm getting late for the ceremony.
Yeah, is there any question you can ask? You all can unmute yourself and you can ask. And please start your videos, participants. Please on your videos. So
Dr.
you can
Ravi,
take some screenshots also.
Dr. Ravi, ma'am is saying that she has to attend another program, and if there are any questions, then the questions can be posted to you.
Yes.
And
so,
we will be directing the all.
But we have to thanks to Professor Namita.
That I'll do.
I would like to invite Professor Mehta sir to please say a vote of thanks on behalf of Inspira.
Namita ji, I'll be very brief since you have to leave now.
Sure.
Dear participants, what I can say about the today's lecture come presentation by Professor Namita Rajput Simply, it was a most outstanding lecture cum presentation by her. And there is no exaggeration if I say that today's lecture was just an encyclopedia on research gap and hypothesis. She has left no part. She has virtually covered every part of this particular topic, and that too quite extensively. And the PowerPoint presentation that she has given, the contents that she has dealt, and moreover, I'm highly impressed by her communication skills also. Very, very impressive. And she has made all the concepts, complicated concepts, quite simple. And what I can say is that it was one of the best lectures that I've ever heard on this particular topic. Thank you, Professor Namita, for such an outstanding presentation. Thank you so much. I'm thankful to our collaborator also. And I'm quite sure that in future also, Professor Namita Rajput will be delivering such lectures and on the forum of Inspira Research Association. I'm thankful to Professor S.S. Modi, our patron and the president of the Inspira Association, under whose leadership the Inspira functions. And finally, I'll say that very special thanks to Dr. Ravikant Modi for conducting this program so nicely. And last and not the least, I'm thankful to each and every participant, right from the very beginning to at this level. Participants have shown so much of enthusiasm by their presence is so much of large number. Thank you, dear participants. In fact, I can say that Professor Namita Rajput was just a Sachin Tendulkar for this workshop. A very, very strong beginning, and I'm sure that in the entire week, perhaps we will be listening eminent experts on the variety of subjects on this particular subject, that is research methodology. Thank you once again. Thank you very much.
Yeah, there's a message which I want to give to all researchers.
Thank you so much.
Just a message to all my
Yes.
researchers here.
Yeah.
That you should be in the field of research like a wheel. There is no beginning, there is no end. Keep rolling and keep rocking. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, ma'am, once
Thank
again
you.
for
Thank
sparing
you.
your valuable time, ma'am.
Thank you.
And thank you so much. And thanks to all the participants. And once again, I would like to thank our collaborator, KG College of Arts and Science. And we shall meet tomorrow on the same time, that is 4:30, for the second day session on taxonomy of literature review and reference management through Mendeley, to be taken by Dr. Hina Thanki, Gujarat Technological University. So thank you so much once again to Professor Mehta sir and all the participants. And feedback we will share at the end of this workshop. On the 7th day, we will share the feedback. So don't worry about feedback. And if any query, you can message me, WhatsApp me, mail, call, anything. Thank you so much.
As mentioned by Dr. Ravi Modi, that the feedback form will be circulated to all. It will be mailed by Dr. Ravikant Modi, in which you can give your feedback for the entire workshop. Thank you.
Yes, yes.
Thank you very much.